Hi, this is Kristen Cayley, and I wanted to give an overview of the California lobbying profession. So let's start off by what is lobbying. Of course, there's the layperson definition. It could be somebody advocating or educating or trying to influence elected or appointed officials. In California, we have the Political Reform Act of 1974, the PRA, which actually provides a definition, including that it's an individual who is paid $2,000 or more in a calendar month for having direct communication for the purpose of influencing legislative or administrative action. Now, I think lobbying is frankly a part of everyday life, whether you're a kid lobbying the parent or spouse lobbying a spouse or a friend or whatever it might be. But we do have a distinction in California for purposes of registration between the paid advocate and the volunteer. In other words, a volunteer is not being paid and therefore doesn't have any lobbying registration requirements here in the state of California, whereas a paid advocate does, so long as they meet that threshold. And once they do, they have quarterly filing obligations. The PRA came about in 1974, of course, shortly after the Watergate scandal, and it was actually backed by, before he was governor, Secretary of State Jerry Brown, in an effort to bring campaign finance and lobbying reform to the state of California. So we have essentially four types of filers: lobbyists, the individual who's doing the lobbying firm that employs a lobbyist employers who employ firms and might employ individual lobbyists themselves, and then so-called $5,000 filers. What types of lobbying do we have? Well, I break it down to legislative, regulatory, and procurement. Some would add budget, but I view budget as a subset of the legislative. Now, procurement lobbying is not regulated in California. If you hearken back to that definition of a lobbyist, it's trying to influence legislative or administrative action. Now, legislative is straightforward: lobbying on a bill, a resolution, a constitutional amendment, any official action, certainly budget lobbying, all is legislative. Administrative, however, is the quasi-legislative side of things, of executive branch administrative agencies. The quasi-legislative is the rulemaking side of the House for those state agencies and departments, boards, commissions, councils in the executive branch. It's when those entities are making laws. They're engaged in quasi-legislative activities. That's lobbying for purposes of registration and disclosure. The other side, the quasi-judicial, when they are enforcing the law, licensing somebody, perhaps disciplining somebody, acting in their enforcement capacity, they're quasi-judicial. That is not defined as lobbying if you are involved in that activity. To be fair, few lobbyists do. It's mainly attorneys or consultants. Procurement is also outside of the definition of administrative action because it isn't quasi-legislative, it's not rulemaking. And so those who lobby in the procurement space, state agencies, the state of California purchases in excess of $10 billion annually of services and goods. And so people who engage in that work where they're trying to get the state of California to purchase goods or services, even when you're doing it on behalf of a client, that procurement lobbying is not considered official lobbying under the Political Reform Act. Then what are the types of lobbyists that we find? Well, there's no formal definition except a lobbyist to require registration and disclosure. But I sort of view them in four buckets: the in-house, association, contract, and the government one. The government one doesn't have any registration requirements as a lobbyist themselves, either working in-house for a local government, could be a transportation agency, an air quality management district, etc., or state. So all those executive branch agencies and departments will have a deputy secretary for legislation, a deputy director for legislation, etc. There are over 200 agencies, departments, boards, and commissions in the state of California. And all of those folks are gubernatorial appointees, and they're basically the administration's lobbyists. Again, they don't require registration or disclosure. The other three types that I mentioned, in-house, association, and contract, are all in the private sector, and they do. In-house, we generally refer to somebody who works full-time for example, a private company, health plans, the oil industry, high tech. All those folks have, the major companies that is, all have in-house government affairs lobbyists. They may do local, may do state, they may do federal, or a combination, maybe local in California, maybe Western states, 2 or more states. Some of these in-house folks do, some of them do both state and federal legislation. Then you have the association lobbyists, and there's basically an association for everyone. Even lobbyists have their own association. So whether it's the business community, like the California Chamber of Commerce, the employee side, like the California Labor Federation, and thousands of associations in between, again, even a lobbyist association to advocate on behalf of the lobbying corps in Sacramento. And then the third is the contract, and like its name denotes, they contract with lobbyist employers, public and or private sector employers, and lobby on behalf based upon the contract that they have with those lobbyist employers. I'm often asked about the typical background of a lobbyist. Many of them have worked years, if not decades, in the California state capitol, or maybe in an executive branch agency or department. Generally, there isn't any specialized training or degree. In fact, there are no actual requirements other than a lobbyist ethics course every 2-year session, registration, a $50 annual fee to be a registered lobbyist in the state of California. What are the types of services that lobbyists typically provide? Everything from what I call the low end of monitoring, simply monitoring legislation and or regulations, to research activities, to drafting memos and advocacy letters, to building coalitions, to helping to draft legislation or regulations. And then, of course, the day-to-day advocacy, whether it's Zoom visits these days or in-person visits to elected officials and their staff, or in the legislative branch, and of course, in the executive branch with appointed officials and their staff, perhaps even testifying in legislative committees or at regulatory hearings. I'm also asked, what is the typical day of a lobbyist? Well, certainly those who do legislative lobbying, Monday through Thursday, a lot of your life is dictated by hearings of Assembly and Senate standing committees, floor sessions on Mondays and Thursdays at least, sometimes the entire week, depending on certain deadline periods. And then in between those hearings and floor sessions are typically visits with elected officials and their staff. And Friday seems to be lots of, calls with colleagues, with clients, meetings, preparing for the following week, drafting, researching, writing your letters of support and opposition, etc. The other thing I'm often asked is what makes an effective lobbyist? And I've come up with just 4 Ps. You could add many more things to this, but in broad strokes, I like to look at policy, process, people, and personality. And what I mean by that is that many of the successful lobbyists out there have one or more areas of policy that they are at least well experienced in, if not experts, because some of them have worked in those areas. Maybe they worked as legislative staff to a committee or for a legislator who really specialized or carried a lot of legislation in some particular policy areas. The next is and this applies to both a legislative or regulatory lobbyist, knowing the policy areas, certainly of their clients and of their client interests. The next is process, whether it's the legislative process, the budget process, or certainly the rulemaking process, having knowledge, experience, familiarity with how those legislative, budget, and regulatory processes work and how you can help navigate your client and their issue or bill or regulation or budget request through those different processes is key. The third is people, and what I mean by that is relationships. Lobbyists knowing in the legislative branch, the elected and appointed officials, in the executive branch, the appointed officials and their staff, and having good professional working relationships with key decision makers and their staff. And the fourth I refer to as personality, just because I sort of view it akin as to the practice of law. We sometimes sort of categorize folks as the research or office lawyer who does the important work, including research and drafting and putting together materials and organizing coalitions and all of that. And then those who more are akin to the courthouse lawyer, the ones who enjoy the day-to-day interactions with officials and staff and appearing before legislative committees or regulatory bodies. There's not necessarily a better personality. It's simply, is your personality one of being behind the scenes, who again does important organizational work and drafting and putting together advocacy letters and studies or research papers on important issues or legislation or regulations? Or do you prefer the other side of the house, the in-person engagement, the public appearances before executive and legislative committees and bodies? So again, sort of a broad overview of the legislative profession of lobbying in California, whether it's the legislative lobbyist or the regulatory lobbyist or some combination between the two. This is just a short overview of the profession here in the state of California.